Goedemiddag aan al onze kijkers. Het is weer tijd voor een interview met key opinion leaders uit de industrie. En vandaag heb ik een speciale gast, Tom Trowbridge, co-founder van Fluence. Nou, Fluence is een DePIN, cloudless computing platform dat een goedkoop alternatief biedt voor traditionele cloud computing. So, Tom, what is it that inspired you to co-found Fluence? Was there a specific gap in the market that led to its creation, or how did it come to fruition?
Well, listen, I think first, before mentioning Fluence, the important thing is my background started off with Hedera. So I joined Hedera from the very beginning, which is layer one. Now it's a top 15, and was very excited. That kind of my intro into the space was building a layer one from scratch, which I think has been, been a big success so far. I think will continue to be. And I think that my view in the space is we need to have decentralization to enable effectively freedom. Funds are a way to do that in a lot of transactions, particularly finance. But there's a lot of compute and a lot of processes that we as consumers and as businesses need to do that are not appropriate for layer one technologies. And so most of the compute you do when you use your phone to get an Uber, when you're on your Netflix account trying to find a movie, when you're searching to try to decode a genome, all that is happening off chain. That is the compute that we are trying to decentralize. Because if we don't, because right now all that compute is happening in the centralized cloud, Amazon, Google, whatever, and even the compute nodes for lots of blockchains, including Ethereum, etc. Most of that compute is also happening in the centralized cloud. So I think that in order to have true decentralization, you have to decentralize the compute piece of it. Otherwise, any layer one, anyone is still subject to a term of service violation of a government or a company saying this has to be shut down. And so we have decentralized payments in terms of Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. We have decentralized storage with like Filecoin, ROE, Storage, others. But the decentralized compute is the last piece that really needs to be decentralized. And without it, we are still subject to the centralized cloud. And so that's the problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, so then exactly that's like the future of the computing would be to decentralize it rather than using centralized nodes like Infura or something along those lines.
Exactly. And by the way, Infura is trying to decentralize, and they have a whole initiative to decentralize, and we've been in big discussions with them. They've joined our DePIN pledge, and the DePIN pledge we've announced are companies that are committing to move some part of their infrastructure to a DePIN network this year in 2025, and Infura is one of those. And so they have DIN, which is their decentralized kind of initiative. And so Infura is obviously the big one in the space that people are quite familiar with that is subject to centralized kind of running, if you will. And so that is a perfect example of the type of project that we hope to play a role in decentralizing and adding resilience to our Web3 world.
Okay, so this leads me to my next question. That is, many blockchain projects struggle with adoption, whether that's technical complexity or regulation. What are the biggest challenges Fluence has faced along the way?
Well, listen, I think, all of this is a very difficult technology to do. And the reason why we run on centralized infrastructure right now is because decentralizing compute is a hard thing to do. And so if it was easy, we would all be running on decentralized stacks right now. So this is a tough problem. We are making great strides in doing it. It's obviously taken longer than we thought. It always is more challenging. That's always the case with technology. So that's kind of the first piece. But what we've done to make our lives a little easier is we've taken a little bit of a different approach from traditional DePIN companies. And so what we see is as projects scale, look at Bitcoin as the first example. Bitcoin started off with people mining Bitcoin in basements, right? And now fast forward, it's a $1.5 trillion, $1.6 trillion asset class, and there is no one mining in basements. And think about it, there are a couple, but it's very rare. And what's the infrastructure? It's like incredibly professional companies, public companies running purpose-built data centers. And so we see that with Filecoin as well. And so we think that infrastructure, especially what I would call digital DePIN infrastructure, inevitably. And so we started with that. And so we started with kind of what's called tier 4, which are the most secure and robust data centers in the world. And that is who our initial partners are. They run out of these data centers. And so we are actually running the compute in the same locations that the top Web2 companies run their compute from. And so that helps customers understand that this is about decentralization, about not one single point of control. But it's not, that doesn't mean it has to run on individual consumer machines all over the world. And so the benefit of that is both the story of it all, but the benefit is also the technical complexity is reduced because we are running in a smaller number of much more performant infrastructure. And that has basically made it a little bit easier for us to make the solution robust and also perceive better than if we were trying to string together thousands of CPUs all over the world with very different levels of connectivity, performance, safety, security, etc.
Interesting. And that leads me to the question of, Fluence claims to be 60 to 80% cheaper than traditional cloud providers. Can you explain how this is possible and how it compares in terms of performance?
Sure. So the reason it's cheaper is that we are monetizing excess compute. And so there's a lot. Think about it this way. We're using CPUs, which are, there have been billions of CPUs sold. They do all the work of the internet. Most decentralized compute providers are providing access to GPUs, which are used for AI model training. That's a huge world. Love that world. It's only going to grow. So very excited by that. But that's very different than the CPU world. In the CPU world, there are excess CPUs in a lot of locations. And so if we onboard these excess CPUs, those providers are interested in getting revenue for them as long as it meets their, is more than their cost of electricity. It's effectively a sunk cost for them. And so that means that we inevitably can be low cost. And the other part here, it's an open network. And because it's an open network, that means that if one provider wants to raise price, me as a customer can easily switch to another provider to lower cost. And being open, which is very different than the cloud, right? The cloud can keep raising prices, but the cost and difficulty of moving is very hard. So people don't do it. And that's why cloud margins are so high. Do this thing called customer lock-in. But there's no lock-in influence, which means that compute will inevitably move to the cheapest providers, assuming similar levels of service, which leaves no pricing power, which means price should always be competed down to the lowest possible level. Again, assuming there's excess capacity in the network, and assuming, if you reach capacity, obviously then you have a different kind of consideration, but we are a long way away from reaching capacity. Yeah. And so that, I think the idea is you set up an economic infrastructure that is basically designed to favor the lowest cost provider and allow that the customers to flow to the lowest cost, will inevitably compete down price to the lowest possible level.
Okay, understood. Interesting. And
and that's also, but to your point though, just to be clear, because this was sort of the implication there, sorry to jump in, is that it's not because of like a subsidy or a token this or that, right? There is token rewards for being on the network early and before we actually have revenue, but the model is designed to be completely, self-sufficient from a low price perspective. Okay. Just to make that obvious point.
And as we know, DePIN is a major trend in Web3, with networks emerging for decentralized storage, connectivity, energy. And you mentioned earlier that Fluence fits in because of the decentralized computing. No one's really doing this. And my question is, do you see Fluence as like a complementary to existing DePIN projects, like for example, Filecoin, or do you just see it as a standalone ecosystem?
Fully complementary. And so as an example, Protocol Labs, the company or the the group behind Filecoin was one of our early investors. And so we're close with Juan, we're close with Molly. And so that is an ecosystem that we are very aligned with and think we're very complementary to. And that is just one example of it. And other examples would be a number of other decentralized projects, other DePINs that are solving other problems that need compute. And that we're in kind of extensive discussions with the suitability of our network for them. And so I don't think any or maybe this project to be successful be completely standalone. I mean, give you another example. We ultimately hope our first customer base here, and this may be jumping ahead to something, but our first customers are going to be third-party node providers. These are companies that are effectively running validator nodes for different blockchains. So right away, we're complementary to the ecosystem. And then ultimately, I hope we actually make the next customer base will be actual blockchains themselves that will run the nodes or encourage their communities to run nodes on Fluence because they're not on the cloud and it's cheaper. And so that's about as integrated and complementary to the broader ecosystem as we could be. And ultimately, I'd love to see a lot of blockchain layer ones having some portion of their compute running on Fluence. So we'll see.
Okay, and as well, yeah, as scalability, network growth, as the demand for decentralized compute grows, how does Fluence ensure that scalability while maintaining a level of decentralization?
Well, I guess the way I'd say that is that we have a long list of compute that would like to join the network. And so that is both much more capacity from the providers we currently have, and also a large number of other providers that would like to join. So our scaling is not a function of supply at this point. It's a function of scaling on demand. And so I think that the bigger we grow, actually, the more decentralized we will become, because we will just add more and more data centers and more providers. And so we actually get more decentralized the more we grow.
Yeah, so rather than the more you grow, the more decentralized points. Yeah. Okay, interesting. And, when it comes to bridging traditional and decentralized computing, do you see Fluence bridging the gap between traditional cloud users and decentralized computing? Or, is this going to be like a slow grind, do you think? Or, because people are used to using centralized, cloud computing.
Yeah.
So.
It's let me phrase it. I'll phrase it to you this way: is that our early customers are going to be Web3, right? They're going to be, or else companies in the Web3 ecosystem, like third-party node providers, maybe layer ones, right? Those are the early customers. For us to get to the scale I can see us getting to, we will need to onboard Web2 customers, and that inevitably happens. But to phrase it differently, this is such an enormous ecosystem that I'm also not worried about it. And to give you a sense of scale, I think the cloud market overall is around 800-ish billion, growing to 2.5 trillion by 2030 or something. So it's an enormous market. And on top of it, you have a lot of complaints that people have in clouds, right? They don't like that they're locked in. They don't like the pricing. They don't like some of the complexity of services. And so we are not a cloud replacement. The level of tooling and of services built on is prohibitive for almost anybody, right? So there's no illusions about we're going to go replace Amazon. But to give you a sense of scale, there are about 600 hyperscaler data centers in the world, roughly. Each one of those on average is about 50,000 CPUs. If we get to the scale of one of those, it would require about $600 million worth of FLT stake, which is many multiples of our fully diluted value right now. So like that is, less than, it's like 15% of 1% of that market. And again, that does, just because it's small doesn't mean we get there, but it just gives you a sense. We got a huge market with a lot of complaints and unhappy customers. Achieving some success in that seems, by the way, that's growing quickly. that's the kind of market I want to target. And
Yeah.
so we're not replacing the cloud at all. But if we get to just a tiny little fraction of it because of all the unhappy customers, we're a runaway success.
Yeah, so your idea is not that you're going to compete with Amazon or any of these, because that would be, like you said, quite a ludicrous achievement to make, near impossible. But you're there to those customers that are unhappy with the centralized format. If you can take, even if it's a small percentage of those to come to decentralized computing,
Right.
that's already a big move.
Huge, and be super clear, in specific use cases. And
Yeah.
so, like, because every use case requires a little bit of specific tooling, specific productization. And so we will that's why we're focused on this one vertical right now. Then there'll be another vertical, and that's kind of how we go through, is that sort of hyper focus on very specific verticals that then gives us a real traction in a particular area, and then we add on top of that over time. We can't just go pick out customers in different segments. That it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. I wish it did.
If you could just nitpick and take whatever you want.
Exactly.
Yeah, if only
That'd
it
be
were that
great.
easy. If only it were that easy. And yeah, this leads me to my last two questions I have, which are, with increasing regulatory scrutiny on whether that's blockchain, crypto, how does Fluence navigate, compliance while maintaining decentralization? Has this been an issue so far for Fluence, or have you been navigating this okay?
Well, I sort of think I answer your question differently. I say that the regulation is actually decreasing. Like I'm sitting in the U.S. right now, where it feels like the shackles and the chains have come off, and everything's is legal and very easy to do now, right? Like if you have the president launch a meme coin, you feel like a pretty permissive environment. So, right. So I think that's the thing. But we did navigate it quite with a lot of care prior to this, and so the token was generated from a Swiss association, which we set up. And so that was where the token, the IP resides, which is important, but it's a US company. And so we are structured it quite carefully from a compliance perspective from the very beginning. But I think permissive regulatory environment, which I'm very excited about, and I think is going to lead to a lot of innovation and a lot of really it's going to help customer adoption, because it sort of it legitimizes the use of these projects in a way that before wasn't really possible. And so you now have much more if you're a customer, if you're a company and you want to use something that's decentralized, there's now not a negative association with doing so, and the perceived risk of doing so, I think, has declined a lot. So I think that is kind of the real opportunity
Yeah,
for us.
and you see this permissive regulatory rather than like regulatory scrutiny. Is this just overall for the whole blockchain ecosystem, or do you mean just for the US and Asia? Or because with MiCa implementations, I am not 100% sure if that affects what Fluence is doing or not.
I'm not. I don't think MiCa is a huge impact on us, but what I guess I would say is that the U.S. and listen, I'm biased, but the U.S. regulatory environment influences other regulatory environments. Right, the U.S. is the biggest capital markets in the world. The SEC is well known for having a global reach, and and taking a very long, aggressive stance at protecting U.S. investors wherever they may choose to invest. Right, so when the U.S. becomes more permissive, that allows other regulatory regimes to be more permissive and also gives guidance about that. And it also, I think, to the extent other regimes are not permissive, it will then attract a ton of business companies, et cetera, to the US to operate from, which is exactly the reverse of how things have been going historically. And so it both is the benefits, and so it leads the rest of the world in terms of regulatory stuff. And if the world doesn't want to do it, well, then it actually puts a lot back in the US, which is the biggest market for customers, for capital, for technology, period, as well. So I think it's only positive in that
Yeah.
regard, in
Yeah,
multiple
so like
ways.
I guess the US is seen as like the not the standard, but kind of it opens the floodgates for other regulatory bodies or countries to be a bit more
Yeah,
less restrictive when it comes to
leverage. Right, and if they're not, then you're right. Europe may not be right. Europe may end up becoming more restricted, and that would be negative for Europe. But that would just lead companies to operate from the U.S., which is a bigger, easier, larger like market in all kinds of
mm.
ways. And so that I think is still.
And now this leads me to my last question, which is, looking ahead to 2025 and beyond, what are the biggest milestones you aim to achieve? Are there any major partnerships or upcoming developments that we should, watch out for?
Yeah, listen, we have a partnership that we're working on that I think would be pretty interesting, but I'm not sure when that will be finalized. But that's one thing in the works. But listen, the main thing we need to do and are doing is just building the pipeline and closing the revenue and the customers. There's a very famous Steve Ballmer chant where he's on stage in Microsoft, where Steve Ballmer's going, developers, 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 right? And for us and for DePIN overall, I think that should just be revenue, 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 revenue. And so I think that is what I'm looking forward to in
Oh,
2025.
awesome. Well, I look forward to keeping up with this, with your steps and how Fluence Network goes. And yeah, thank you very much for your time. That was the end of the interview.
Great. Well, dank je wel.
Graag gedaan, Tom.